episode of Code Concepts with myself, Rachel Patterson, and Pete Roque. So as you know, Pete and I like to bring you guests who have something relevant to share in our industry, things that impact us in so many ways. Today, I'm so excited about our guest, who I will let Pete introduce here in a moment. But you know, this guest, after really looking him up and kind of becoming a stalker on his awesomeness on LinkedIn and YouTube, I have to say, you know, our guest brings so much to our profession, but just brings so much to everything else as well, with his vast amount of knowledge. So I'll give it over to Pete, but I'm super excited to hear all about our special guest that we have today.
So we have Charles Llano here today. Charles Llano was the former police chief of the city of Tustin, California. For you guys that don't know where Tustin is, it's close to Disneyland. It's in the Orange County. So for you guys that watch Orange County Housewives, that's where it's at. So so I served in a nearby city in Garden Grove. So I'm pretty aware with Tustin. So he is the president of Chief Leadership, which is a group, consulting group that gives a lot of information and a lot of leadership training to masses. So I was able to, on LinkedIn, I saw his profile, I looked him up, and I was floored with the information that I saw. You know, one of the things that we'd like to bring on our show is people with a real story. So in his story, he talked about, being the chief of police and how he was a hot mess. And I love it. I'm going to let him go on with it. But with that, I'm going to bring you Chief Charles Llano.
Good morning, Mr. Llano.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Pete and Rachel, so much for having me this morning. And you're building me up way too much.
No.
That's for sure. But to go back to what Pete said about a hot mess, I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But it's really an honor to be part of this and what you guys do. I've had an opportunity to listen to the podcast and to follow what you're doing, and you're doing great work. And certainly for the code enforcement profession, I have the privilege to work with code enforcement professionals throughout the state of California. And it's amazing what you do. And it kind of unsung heroes in a lot of ways in the different communities, because what you do makes a difference in the community. So thank you so much for what you do. And thanks for having me. So yeah, I mean, I was a mess in many ways, but I had a lot of successes and a lot of failures throughout my career. But just to give you a little bit of background, I did work for Tustin, as Pete said, for 27 years. Had a wonderful, blessed career. Spent a lot of time in the operations side of law enforcement. Worked a lot of patrol. I was a narcotics officer. I was on a county task force. I worked with the gang unit for many years. Had a lot of fun. And then at a certain point, I decided, hey, I should try and promote up through the ranks. And I was fortunate enough to ultimately, promote up to sergeant, lieutenant, captain, and then ultimately the chief of police. And I was a chief there for the last 5 years of my career. And that was a very rewarding experience, but also a challenging one in many ways. And ultimately, it was that position and the stress associated with that position that actually forced my hand to re-career sooner than I wanted to. I actually left 2 years prior to being retirement eligible, which is kind of unheard of, as you know, in public government in our world. People don't leave before they're retirement eligible. But what happened to me was in 2018, I had a heart scan. And this was actually part of a wellness program that I, kind of implemented or helped to implement at the department. And ironically, I became the poster child for this heart scan because the scan didn't come out very, very good. And I was actually shocked because, I thought I was a pretty healthy guy. I was exercising, was eating okay, and, in my mind, I thought, well, this is going to be a no-brainer, right? I'm going to go in, get this heart scan. It's going to come up with a 0 score because that's what you want when you get a heart scan. And lo and behold, that is not what happened with me. And the way the heart scan works is it measures the calcification in and around your coronary arteries. And based on that, you get a score. And if you have no calcification, which is probably the case for you guys, because for most people, they don't have that. If you have no calcification, you get a 0 score. So people kept coming back to work like, I got a 0. So I'm like, I'm going to get my scan. I'm going to get a 0, no problem. And as I mentioned, that's not what happened. When I sat down with the cardiologist, they said, oh, Mr. Solano, we have good news and bad news. And I was like, okay, this is not good. A cardiologist telling me there's bad news. And she said, yeah, the bad news is you have a moderate level of calcification in your heart, which means you have coronary artery disease. And it like hit me like a ton of bricks. Like I just couldn't believe it, that was happening to me. And I said, well, what's the good news? The good news is, well, it's not severe yet. It's moderate. But for my age, I was in the 90th percentile, meaning that if you put me in a room with 100 men my age, 89 of them would have a healthier heart than me. So this really was a shock to me and to my system. And I went home and talked to my wife. I have 5 children, and my wife was very supportive of it. And I'm like, I don't know, should I go back to work? Should I, what should we do? And she's like, well, I support you, whatever you want to do. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to quit. I can't quit. I'm not a quitter. I got to go back to work. And what I learned about heart disease is there's really 3 contributing factors, right? So one is genetics. So your DNA, it's in you, it's hereditary. There's nothing you can do about that, right? It's in your genes. 2 are your lifestyle choices. So how you choose to eat, you exercise, all those things that have to do with your health and wellness. And the 3rd one, and the most important one for me, was stress. And chronic stress, untreated or mismanaged, can actually lead to chronic disease, in particular heart disease. And so I learned about this. And again, I said to my wife, I go, I don't want to just give up, after 27 years, I love this career. And she said, well, I support you. So I went back to work. And a few months later, I had what I call my crucible moment, right? So I came home from work one night, and it was one of those rare times as a chief that you actually have a free evening. So I was able to come home, and I was able to tuck my sons into bed. I love being able to do that. They were younger at the time. And I was tucking my middle son, Anthony, into bed that night, and he was 12. And Anthony is like my sensitive one, right? He's very intuitive. He's very sensitive and quiet. And I'm tucking him into bed. And keep in mind, I don't talk to my kids about, my health problems or stress in my life, or just, as far as my kids are concerned, Dad is like Superman, And so I'm tucking him into bed, and I bend over to give him a hug and a kiss. And he says, Dad, when are you going to retire? And I was like taken aback by that. I'm like, well, I don't know, buddy. Like, why do you ask? And what he said next really changed the course and direction of my life from that point forward. He said, I just think you would feel better, Dad. Oh. And my heart like sank into my stomach. And I was like, okay, he could see it on my face, right? He can feel it. I don't need to tell him about the stress of the job. I don't need to tell him about my heart scan. Like he felt it. And I walked into my bedroom. My wife was there. I had tears in my eyes. And I'm like, I can't do this anymore. And so I left that career that I loved because I didn't want to die in that chief's office. And honestly, guys, like, I believe that if I stayed, I don't know if I'd be sitting in front of you today to be able to have this conversation, because it really was the best decision of my life, because I was able to learn about my health, to learn about heart disease, to really turn that ship around. And, I'm so much better off now. I'm so much happier. I'm so much more relaxed. I'm able to manage the stresses of life a lot better. And now, and that really drove me to the point of creating this company, Chief Leadership, because I want to talk to the Charlies of, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and say, hey, wake up. Like, don't make the same mistakes that I made, because you can do this. You can manage your stress in a lot more productive way, in a lot healthier way. So that's what I do now. I go around and I do leadership workshops, and I do coaching, and I love it. And I hope that I'm helping, people in our business, in our industry, community service, public service, to, kind of what I say, survive and thrive in your career, and not just in your career, but in your retirement. Because unfortunately, in public service, the stats are not good. People work 25, 30, 35 years, and then they retire, and then they die. I mean, I know it's kind of morbid, but like, the stats just are not good. So I'm trying to bust that average. I want to get people to like live 30, 35 years in retirement and really enjoy that retirement they deserve. So that's pretty much my story in a nutshell. And there's a lot more to it, obviously, but that's pretty much kind of the Reader's Digest version of who I am and how I got here.
Mr. Llano, it's amazing how intuitive our children are to our own needs. So I have to ask just personally, because I find myself in a lot of those same boats, maybe not at the high level that you were at, but how did that change your home life as well? Not only did that relieve the stress, it sounds like, of the professional, steps that you were taking, but really, how did that affect your family?
Making that decision to leave?
Mm-hmm.
It was, well, I mean, I guess it was a mixed, effect, because here I am now faced with the new stress of having to support a large family without an income. So that created a different type of stress. But the positive side to that was I was home so much more with my wife and my kids, and I was, like I said, I was able to start laughing again and smiling again and feeling better and sleeping better. And so that had just a tremendously positive impact on the home life and the personal life. And that's like, Rachel, like that's the most important thing. We all have these careers and we're dedicated to our careers and we're professionals and it's important to us. But, for me, it doesn't define me. My profession did not completely define who I am. It was part of who I am. But I often see people in our profession, in public safety and even your profession, that are just consumed with the job, right? It's all consuming. And when your career is over, what do you have, right? You're left with the people who are the most important to you and that other aspect of your life that hopefully you haven't neglected for years and years. So it really helped to give me perspective that I kind of already knew, but it just being home and being present was a blessing, absolute blessing.
I like that. Just watching some of your videos, you can just see, that love that you have. And I think it's important that we as an industry recognize and remember that, when we get out of this industry, we still have something to offer, because not only did you offer the most insanely amazing public service that anyone can, but now you're offering almost an even better service. Like I said, looking through some of your videos, it's inspiring. So I'm almost more excited to see you on this side, sir.
Yeah,
well,
and
thank you.
one of
That's
the
really
things
kind.
that yeah, one of the things that that many of us deal with it. Like you said, you have that one evening that you didn't have a phone call, because being in that position, me as a code enforcement manager, we get those calls like, "Hey, a building's falling apart. Can you go over there right now?" And you'd have to rush, and everything's an emergency. When you're in that level, everything's an emergency, so you have to respond right away. So you do neglect the family, and having that moment. I had changed over to the private sector from government. And for me, it was a really, really big jump. And I'm pretty sure it was a big jump for you.
Oh, yeah.
But the thing that I always tell people, when you tell folks to think outside the box, you're still confined within a box. When you're in the public sector, like right now, when you're thinking outside the box, there is no outer box. You can just do and inspire more. So you're now reaching another level of inspiring people. And we talked about some of the clients that you have, and I know some of these clients, and you know what, I can tell you a lot of these folks need that type of mentorship, leadership, because you know what, in our profession we don't get taught that. We just don't. And having folks like you coming out there and saying, "Hey, there's a better way to to live," it's just good to hear. And I love to touch upon some of the stuff that you're gonna talk about today. So
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think you brought up a couple of good points there. One is we need to set boundaries. Whether you're in a director position, executive position, supervisor, manager, everything's not an emergency. And so to really prioritize and set boundaries as to what is truly an emergency, because I think for a lot of us, we get caught up in, I've got to have this phone at the ready. I've got to have it right next to me. It's the first thing I look at in the morning when I wake up. I'm checking my emails. It's the last thing I look at before I go to bed. Well, guess what? That has an impact up here. It has an impact on your sleep. It has an impact on your overall health. And it's really not necessary. So learning to really identify what those boundaries need to be, what truly is an emergency, hey, if you need to get a hold of me, just call me. Like, I'm not going to have my phone dinging every time an email goes off. Those are important things to really sit down and think about, because over time, it's a cumulative effect. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it's easy to get caught up in that, just like I did. I was lucky to sleep 3 or 4 hours a night every night. And over time, that's going to have, as it obviously did, a negative impact on a person's physical health for sure.
Yeah. So in doing your leadership training, what's the one thing that really comes to the surface every time you're teaching? You're like, it's a constant, like, somebody has stress about work, or what are some of the things that normally come up and that you normally train on?
There's so many things, but I mean, I was talking to you guys before we kind of went live here. I've had the privilege to do some training for code enforcement groups, and the challenges that I think this is relevant for your audience. The challenges that code enforcement professionals face are very real, especially over the last 2 years with COVID, and trying to navigate that. And tensions are high, right? People are just upset. They're just upset, period. Whether it's politics or getting sick or safety or whatever it is, people are just tense. And so now you're going to these situations and dealing with conflict and dealing with difficult people. And how do you manage that? How do you manage your own emotions? So I'm doing a lot of training on emotional intelligence, right? How to understand your own self-awareness and how to do some self-management. So when that person gets in your face and says, you can't come in here and do an inspection, and this is BS, and I have a right to do this. How do you manage your emotions in a way that's going to lead to a productive outcome, right? You're still going to accomplish your job, but how can you do that in a way that's not going to get you in trouble? It's not going to get you hurt, and you're going to be able to, hopefully de-escalate that situation. So a lot of emotional intelligence training. From a leadership perspective, there's so much, just how to lead yourself, how to hold other people accountable. A lot of talk about how do I have a conversation with a direct report that, it's a tough conversation. Like, it's about their performance, or they're not, they're showing up late to work, or it's a conversation I really don't want to have, but I need to have it. And I talk about those as courageous conversations. That's, what I talk about a lot in our training. And I give tools for people to have those, to start those conversations, because they're not easy to start. Like, how do you start that conversation? And so we talk about effective communication and how to, speak from an I statement, and how to actively listen. And a lot of communication and a lot of conflict resolution is kind of ingrained in this leadership training, because you're dealing with people. Leadership is about people, right? I talk a lot about the difference between leadership and management, and I ask my participants in the workshops, what's the difference between leadership and management? And it all comes down to this: like, leadership is about people, and management is about things and processes and projects. And both of those things are important, right? You need management skills to get things done, but you need leadership skills to really motivate and get people to do what needs to be done. And when you cross those things over, when you start managing people like you manage things or manage projects, that's when leaders run into a lot of problems, right? So you gotta have both those skills. And so we spend a lot of time talking about the people side of things, and how to connect, and how to engage, and how to be present, and how to listen, and simple things, right, in concept, but a lot more difficult to actually implement.
Well, that's why, looking at your profile here on all the many vast areas to find your stuff, there's a lot on there, and it covers so much, whether it's self-help, whether it's, emotional intelligence like Mr. Marco Flores, and good morning to our guests too, Miss Cece, Charles, Marco, Kenneth. I think we're all on that same page. So how did you really get to that point where you wanted to get this information out, in a platform?
Well, I mean, from my own experience, it started as, while I was on the job and attending leadership training myself and really loving it. Like, I'm just a leadership nerd. Like, I don't consider myself an expert in leadership. I don't consider myself an expert at all. I consider myself a student of leadership, and I'm just a geek about it. Like, I love to read everything and listen to podcasts and learn as much as I can about this fascinating world of leadership, because to me, it's both art and science, right? It's not just, you can't give a new supervisor a book, like, a little playbook, and say, here, just follow this and you're going to be a perfect leader. It doesn't work like that. It's so much more complicated and nuanced because you're dealing with people. So my fascination started when I started learning about leadership, and really had the privilege to go to some great leadership training. I had the opportunity to go to the FBI National Academy as a police chief back in 2014, and that was just an amazing experience, meeting people from all over the world, public safety leaders from all over the world, and now having those contacts and those connections and learning from them was amazing. So I think having those experiences and then seeing the challenges to lead, challenges that I faced, like where I screwed up and I'm like, how can I do this better? How could I have handled that conversation better? How could I have made that decision a little more thoughtfully, a little more responsibly as a leader? And just kind of making those mistakes, I go, you know what? I can't be the only one making these mistakes, right? There's got to be other people making mistakes. And so it just led me to the point where, again, after having that moment in time where I was forced to re-career and thinking, what do I really love to do? And then I asked people that I trusted, to say, what do you think I can offer? I'm not doing this, as a police chief anymore. What do I have to offer? And a lot of that feedback was, well, health and wellness, because you love those things, and leadership, and just teaching and speaking and helping and coaching and helping other people, learn. So that's that led me to this point, I guess.
One of the things that, I too am a leadership nerd, and so is Rachel. She's the bigger leadership nerd. But, in the end of the day, us in public service, I mean, we deal with people every day, and our interactions, I mean, that speaks volumes of who we are. Because, I've seen a lot of code enforcement officers, they go to different places and they treat their clients or their residents, like, hey, I'm the law. This is what I do.
Right.
And you know what? We need to step back and say, hey, how are we here to help you? What can we do to serve you? And having that mentality, it takes you leaps and bounds when you're dealing with folks, because you get calls for service and you have to resolve some disturbance. People don't call you to wish them a good day. They call you because they have a
Sure.
problem. You're there to solve it. And with code enforcement, we get a call where they're doing something wrong, so we have to
Yes.
deliver that message, and second, we have to correct that message. So and the type of tone that you have with people, the way you interact, emotional intelligence, that is key. And I tend to tell people, hey, you know what? A lot of the officer safety concerns is because somebody acted in a way they shouldn't have, and it could have been avoided. And I always say, you know what? The option is to walk away when it's getting like heated, because as with law enforcement officers, you guys have the equipment that you can stick around. We don't.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So for us, we have to come in there, talk to people in a nice tone, the face with the smiling face, and say, hey, how are we there to help you? And I think people need to really focus on that information. And how do you get that message across to folks that don't have that mindset? How do you get that message across?
It's a great point, and it's not easy, because, and in many ways I don't blame code enforcement professionals or law enforcement professionals who over time become jaded. It's easy to become jaded and cynical because you're dealing with, like you said, Pete, just the negativity. People are not calling you to say, hey, I just want to say you're great and thank you for what you do. This is not happening, right? There's a violation. There's a some type of code compliance issue, and now you got to go out and be the bad guy a lot of times. And what I try to do is get the message across to the leaders that, look, it's going to make your job easier, not harder in the long run, right? It might be hard at the time to kind of, all right, I got to keep my emotions in check. I got to keep my ego in check. I got to let this person yell and scream a little bit, let them get this, whatever it is, off their chest. And then I can approach this thing, from a different perspective in a calmer tone. Ultimately, that's going to make your job easier, not harder. And so I'll show examples. I'll show video examples of, things that have gone, sideways and not ended well for, that public safety professional. And it's just a reminder. It's a constant reminder. You have to constantly remind each other and keep each other in check. When I talk to teams, I go, your obligation as a fellow teammate is to, hey, if you see your code enforcement partner kind of losing it, or like they seem a little tense and they're getting into it with somebody, tap in, like, hey, partner, I got this, let me deal with this person, because everybody has a bad day, right? And so helping each other as teammates, holding each other accountable is really important, and being willing to have those conversations and having an open, honest dialogue with each other. Like, hey, you know what? When you're in your team briefings, if I start losing it with somebody, will you step in? Like, help me out. Yeah. And will you do the same for me? Absolutely. I encourage those conversations so that when it happens, because it's going to happen, right? Because you're a human being. When it happens, you have that accountability. Because you're typically not going out by yourself to these types of calls. You're going to have your partner there. So, that's a big part of it. So encouraging that team environment, I talk a lot about accountability, self-accountability, team accountability, peer-to-peer accountability, helping your boss be a better boss, right? Because sometimes our bosses struggle. So it really comes down to accountability, but ultimately just sending the message that this is going to make your job easier, not harder. And we talk about stress and self-care and wellness and physical health. That stress and that anger and dealing with conflict in a poor way is going to take its toll on you physically, and not in a good way. So most people recognize that and go, you know what? That's not where I want to be. So let me try and figure this out. But it's not easy, right? It's just a constant reminder for people.
Oh, absolutely. And you have to say, thank you to Mr. Llano, because ultimately the way I look at leadership is we have to be willing to talk about what's good, what's bad, and what's in between. And not often do you find someone like you who's willing to digest a situation or an experience or, an issue out in the field and figure out, what can we do to bring that accountability back. So I do want to say thank you for that.
Sure.
Being that type of a leader that's willing to go that extra mile, not just what's in the playbook of, this is how a police officer is supposed to act, or this is how a code enforcement officer is supposed to, do their job based on the manual.
People don't respond to that. I mean, and especially, people are smart, and they're coming into this profession with the right mindset and the right attitude. But again, you can get jaded and cynical, but you need to be authentic as a leader with people. You got to tell them the good, the bad, the ugly. Because if you just give them this varnished, polished version of, here's the policy, you go do it, they're not gonna connect with you, right? So being vulnerable as a leader is really important. Like telling your team, hey, you know what? I don't have all the answers. I always ask my students in the workshops, I go, what do you do when an employee comes to you, you're the supervisor, and they ask you a question and you don't know the answer? And your response should be what? What do you think, Rachel or Pete? What's your response be?
Sorry, Pete, go ahead.
No. My response normally when I don't have the answer, I'm like, you know what? I don't know. Let me get that information for you. Yes, that would be my response. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's okay to say I don't know as a leader, right? I don't know. Let me get that answer for you, but take it one step further. I'm going to get that answer to you by the end of the week or by the end of the business day today. Mm-hmm. And then you follow through. Because what happens when you do that is you're building trust with your employees, and you're showing that you don't have all the answers. You're showing your vulnerability, and that's gonna open the door for them to be vulnerable. It's going to open the door for them to be honest with themselves and to show some humility. And that's really important, because if you put on this facade as a leader, like, I got it all figured out, I know everything, they put me in this job for a reason, that's not going to work well with your employees. It's going to affect that level of trust. But so many times I see new supervisors, new leaders get in that role, and they're like, I got to have all the answers. No, you don't. You really don't. So again, we talk a lot about that, about humility and being open and vulnerable and being authentic.
One thing as a former manager, and I always tell people, there's no manual to be a supervisor. People don't pull you aside and teach you how to lead people. They don't. And I think that's lacking. One of the things that I used to do just to kind of see where my employees were, I actually go on in the field. In code enforcement, we go solo. We respond to a lot of these calls by ourselves. So we don't have that partner to say, hey, partner, sometimes we do, but I make it a point to go out, and that way I can, when I get those complaints, I know my employees' tone, I know their type of, their character, I get to know them. And, one of the things I always stress is like, I'm like a coach. You can't train not everybody's going to be a shortstop. You have your strong players, you have your catchers,
Right.
your right fielders, your left fielders. You have to practice different drills with them. And one of the things that I always tend to look at is say, okay, is the complaint about my employee? Is it a real complaint? Is is that something they would do? And normally it's like, yeah, it's something they would do, because I know my employee.
You know your employee.
Yeah, so I have to talk to them and say, hey, look, I'm not signing with this, but maybe the tone, da da da, and I never accuse them, but I always make them aware that I know what they're doing, what they're not doing, and I think communication is key, being authentic to them, because sometimes you being real with them and then being real with you, you develop this camaraderie, but at the same time, it can be hard. It can be hard, like communicating with them, because once you get to know somebody, you build a bond with them, and then, taking that step to, when they did something wrong and calling them out, it kind of breaks that bond. So how do you talk to your employees once that trust is broken sometimes?
That's a great question. Trust is so precious and dear. And we talk a lot about trust in leadership training, and if you break that trust, it's going to take a long time to earn that back. So the main thing is to try and avoid breaking that trust in the first place. But I think to your earlier point, when you're having those courageous conversations, we call them, or you're having that feedback session with that employee, things didn't go well, you got a complaint, I think the key is, as a supervisor, as a leader, is to ask questions. I would sit down with that employee. First of all, give them the benefit of the doubt, right? Because they're doing great work for the community with good intentions. People don't come to work with bad intentions. Like, I wonder if I can, screw up today, and how can I make a complaint for my boss, Pete? Like, they don't do that, right? So
Right.
give them the benefit of the doubt. Sit down with them. Time, place, and manner is very important. I talk a lot about time, place, and manner with giving feedback. Pick the right time to give feedback. So if the complaint came in, this morning, let's say, and you wait 2 weeks to then have that conversation with the employee about that, is that a good time to have that conversation? No, right? It's not fresh in everybody's mind. You don't want to wait that long. But do you want to have that conversation, the next morning when they come into work, they're not settled yet, they haven't put their stuff away, they're just getting settled in their job? No, right? You want to pick the right time to have that feedback and that conversation. Place, are you going to have this conversation, this feedback session, in front of their peers? And you might like shake your head and go, who does that, Charlie? People do this all the time. They do. Like I was training, I was teaching a class with another consultant friend of mine a couple of years ago. And this is a class of 30 people. This is an agency local here. And we're getting ready to start the class. It's like just prior to 8 a.m. That's when the class starts. And we've got 30 people from this police department sitting in this room. In the back of the room walks one of their lieutenants. The lieutenant walks up to one of the officers with a piece of paper in his hand and says, here's your written reprimand. Go ahead and sign this so I can get this filed. In front of everybody, in front of the class. And I mean, I looked at my partner and I was like, you got to be kidding me. Is this really happening right now? This stuff really happens. Like, that is not the time or the place or the manner in which to give that feedback, to have that conversation. But it still happens, right? That type of leadership or lack of leadership really affects morale in such a powerful way. People don't forget that. So asking questions, right? Okay, so I had this complaint. Hey, I'd like to talk to you about that call that you went on yesterday, at 8123 A Street. How do you think that went? Because trust me when I tell you, your employees, they know. Like, they know when it didn't go well. They know when they overstepped their bounds. They know when they probably, and they'll tell you, like, yeah, I got a little upset. I probably shouldn't have. So just give them an opportunity, like, ask those questions and then ask why. Okay, why? Were you having a bad day? Like, what's going on? This is like the second complaint in last month. Is everything okay? They might tell you, you know what? I didn't want to tell you this, but having some problems at home and it's kind of affected. Okay, is that important for you to know as a leader? Yes. Like, so just demonstrating that empathy, that compassion, taking a step back, not just jumping down their throat. Hey, I got this complaint yesterday. It's a second complaint I got against you. That's really important. Your employees will appreciate you giving them the benefit of the doubt and taking that approach to asking them, these questions rather than just, hey, this is another complaint, sign here, right? So it's really about manner, time, place, and manner.
That is great information, Mr. Solano. I mean, just in my own work history, I would love to have you as a leader. So we do have a question and a comment from Mr. Flores. He says, thanks for the amazing and consistent content, Mr. Pete Roque. Awesome. It says he has a question for your guest. So I can speak to this one too, but then we'll let you answer it as well, Mr. Solano. It says, what books or podcasts would you recommend for those interested in learning more about leadership? So real quick, before you answer that, I have to say, get on and subscribe to Chief Leadership. Certainly.
Thank you for that shameless plug. Thank you.
Really though, it's worth it because, sir, you're bringing so much to us as individuals, so much to our industry. But I'd love to hear more about, again, the question, what do you recommend for us? What do you recommend we get interested in to learn more about leadership?
Oh my gosh, how much time do you have? I know we don't have much time, but there's
for you all day. It's
such a great question, and there's so much information out there. There's a lot of good information and then some not so good. But I have a recommended reading list because I get this question a lot. And so I created this recommended reading list that I can share with you guys, and you can share that with your listeners. But the one book that I'll mention that I think is really important, and it ties into what we just talked about emotional intelligence and self-control and self-management. It's a book that I read every couple of years, and it's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And it's not your traditional leadership book, but it's a very powerful book. And Viktor Frankl, who is a survivor of the Holocaust, writes about his experience in the concentration camps and the death camps and how he survived that experience. And ultimately, just to kind of sum it up for you, he recognized that, where his true power came from. He learned to not focus on things that he didn't have control over, because in that extreme environment, you have control over very little, right? It's just it was a horrible experience. And he learned that, I need to stop spending energy and focusing on things over which I don't have control. Let me just focus on the things over which I have control. And what he realized in that extreme circumstance is, I only have control over how I choose to respond to these things. So this is happening to me. This horrible thing's happening to me. This terrible thing's happening. I have power over how I choose to respond to those things. And from that power, he was able to ultimately survive that experience, at least in his belief. And so he took that knowledge and experience and created an entire, psychotherapy, model. And he became this, really important psychologist in the field. But that book itself, Man's Search for Meaning, you only have to read the first half, because the second half is all about psychology, but the first half is his story. Super powerful. When I read that book 25 years ago, it was life-changing for me because I was spending a lot of energy and a lot of time focusing on things over which I didn't have control. And I think many of us find ourselves in situations where, that happens. People are this COVID thing and vaccine, no vaccine, mask, no mask, like a lot of that stuff you don't have control over. So stop spending that energy, that precious energy on that stuff over which you don't have control, and focus on how you choose to respond to those things. Super powerful book. Not your traditional leadership book, but man, I highly recommend that to everybody who asks me about what books.
And I think that's a great book, just hearing about it and reading a little bit on the topic. What I kind of get out of it is ultimately imagining the outcome. Pete tells me this all the time. It's about imagining yourself in that position or imagining that outcome. And it is a great read. I absolutely agree with that one.
I love that. What that reminds me of is visualization. Yeah. I talk a lot about visualization. I think that's what you're talking about. And that is so powerful, visualizing yourself ahead of time. We do this in police work. In the academy, they tell you to visualize, okay, you're driving you're driving throughout your city and all of a sudden a bank robbery call comes out and you roll up on the bank and somebody runs out of the front with a gun. What do you visualize it yourself? How are you going to handle that tactically? Well, you can use that skill, that visualization skill, in everything you do. Like, okay, I'm dealing with a difficult employee. I'm dealing with a difficult client or customer. Visualize yourself handling that situation in a productive, powerful way ahead of time. And what's going to happen is when that situation happens and now you're stressed, you're going to default to that visualization, that neural pathway that you already created, and you're more likely to have, a better outcome. So I love that, Pete, that you talk about, imagining or visualizing that, because it's really powerful.
Yeah, one of the things I tell folks, you're your own you set your own boundaries and your own obstacles. And you know what? When you visualize yourself doing what you want to do, all those obstacles tend to go away. And like you said, you focus on the things that you have control over. I can't control somebody else's attitude or somebody else, what they think of. I can't control that. So you know what? I'm not going to, me personally, I'm not going to care about it. And one of the things I tell Rachel all the time, and Cecilia, and anybody who talks to me, I'm like, you know what, you can do whatever you set your mind to. It's the limits are endless. I always tend to, I'm not a leadership speaker. I'm just a guy that just helps people get to their next goal. And you know what, I love what I'm hearing because I love it. It's like, good. I feel like I took your class already. So, but end of the day, you're 100% right. Me, for example, I never, when I started code enforcement, I never saw myself in the private sector. I never saw it, and even making that jump, I said, where am I going to go? How am I going to do this? And I visualized myself building something greater. And you know what? We built this podcast to inform fellow code officers. And I visualized myself reaching out to you and having you on this show. And guess what? You're on here today.
And look what happened. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there you go. You're giving us this great goodness of information, and I love it. And I think people need to hear this stuff. I mean, you're a keynote speaker. Code enforcement associations are always looking for good speakers. And you know what? We're giving you a platform because you know what? We believe in your message. And this is stuff that we need as code enforcement officers. We need to hear this stuff, because we don't get this, when we go to training, how to write a notice or how to, we don't learn about the emotional intelligence. We don't learn about setting goals. We don't learn about removing these obstacles that in our pathways. So, I think this is valuable information.
That's typical, that you learn about nuts and bolts and you need that stuff, right? And probably at your conferences, it's all about compliance issues and laws and mandates, and that stuff's important. But a lot of times if we're going to cut somewhere, it's usually these type of things, like the leadership training or what people call the soft skills, which is funny because that term I think is misleading because leadership is so important. I just posted this morning on LinkedIn about a police chief sadly, went from one department to the next and had just a mass exodus of officers leaving the organization. And they came out publicly and said it's because of his toxic leadership. We do so much damage if we're not paying attention to our leadership, like damage that costs money, like real money, and not to mention the psychological impact on people.
Right.
So it's not really a soft skill. It's an important skill, but unfortunately, you're right, Pete. Like it's a lot of times it gets overlooked, or we don't. We'll get to that when we have time. That's my struggle, right? Just trying to get cities, organizations, nonprofits to recognize, hey, this stuff is important. And a lot of my clients, they do recognize that. So that's, it's a blessing for me. But you also made me think of another person I follow, going back to, I think was it Gabriel's question about people to follow. And there's somebody by the name of David Goggins. I don't know if you guys have heard of David Goggins. He's a former Navy SEAL. Also wrote a book called Can't Hurt Me. But such an inspirational guy to me. Very extreme, but so it depends on your taste, but I really love him. But he talks about you have the ability to control your brain. And a lot of times people allow their brain to control them.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're talking about, Pete, is kind of rewiring your brain and taking action, and you can control your brain so that you can accomplish the things you want in life instead of just kind of floating through life and going, well, whatever happens to me, just let it. You can control that, and you can really rewrite those neural pathways in your brain. It sounds like woo-woo stuff, but I'm telling you, I've seen so many examples of this working. It works in my own life, and people like you, like the reason, you're successful, I think both of you, is you're taking action. And a lot of times I talk about imperfect action is better than no action at all. Some people are held back, like it's not perfect. Like this podcast is not perfect. Like you have a very nice podcast, but if you waited for your podcast to be perfect before you did it, you'd never do it. Right. But imperfect action is better than no action at all. And you start to just slowly improve over time. So you made me think of both. You're making me think of a lot of good stuff. Thank you, guys.
I like that, because ultimately we could come on here and we could talk about, how do you write a notice of violation? How do you testify in court? But I think really what Pete and I are trying to do, and Cecilia and Pete, is bring that message, bring exactly what you're talking about here, is that there's more to it than just the day-to-day processes. Not only is it about, taking care of ourselves and our mental health like you did, but providing a message in a different way, in a different platform to reach so many people. So your message is just powerful and super inspiring.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate that.
So Charles, I love David Goggins, by the way.
Okay,
He does curse a lot, but I love it.
That's why I said it's not everybody's taste.
You know what? One of the things, he was running one time. He's like, when I don't feel like making my 20-mile run, and I start giving an excuse, I tape myself, and I sound like such a girl. The way he says it. And you know what? One time, I started talking to myself. I talk to myself a lot, which is another level of craziness. But I tell myself, hey, why am I doing this? Why am I not doing this? And you know what? When I start rationalizing what I'm doing or what I'm not doing, it's amazing how your brain and your body tells you so much about yourself. And and one of the things that I'm a bit advocate about, and this emotional intelligence and knowing myself, is when we communicate as public servants. I've had people tell me I couldn't sleep because of what you're doing to me. That has an impact on ourselves because we're affecting people's lives. Sure. We're now inserting ourselves in a not negative way. And so I tell people, look, when we talk to the public, we have to be empathetic and keep in mind that we're affecting their lives. Yeah. So being the best versions of ourselves is important when we go out there. It's just not another call. Yes, we have to look at it differently because we're there to serve the public. And I think that message gets so missed, because people are more concerned about, I have 50 cases. I'm like, well, you're only handling one house at a time. So right. Be the best version of yourself when you're at that home and work with people, tell them what's going on, and give them options. We had somebody the other day say, we never say no. We had Victor Martinez on another show, and he
Right.
said, never say no. You give them options. You give them a way to communicate, because no is a negative thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you don't want to get rid of your 1985 Toyota Corolla that you had a prom date with. That's fine. But you know what? You can't. These are the options. You don't have to get rid of it, but you have to register it. You have to put it out of public view.
Right.
Give them options. And I think, having that personal, awareness of, you being, that emotional intelligence is important when you go to someone's door, because your interaction will last, because you're a public servant. That interaction will last for a long time.
Oh,
They're going to say, oh yeah, the city, they're a bunch of jerks. So,
right.
or you can say, what, the city guy was awesome. And I'm going to tell you a quick story of how I ended up in code enforcement. The way my brother had a stroke, and code enforcement got called because the fire department couldn't pull my brother out of home. I ended up meeting a code enforcement officer. I was in the military at the time, and I was communicating with him overseas, to help my parents to reach compliance. And that's how I first got introduced to code enforcement, through a negative interaction. But that guy was so cool. Years later, I got to teach that same guy. And he was a fan of mine. I'm like, you know what? You don't remember me, but you're one of the reasons that I got into code enforcement, because you wrote my parents up. And it was such a kind of 360. But I get to inspire folks like that nowadays to be better, be better role models.
Yeah. What a great story. Wow. What an awesome experience. Thank you for sharing that. I love what you talked about, taking it one house at a time, one call at a time, and try not to allow it to kind of accumulate. And one of the things that can help with that, because I like to give people tools they can use, is a tool that I use a lot, and it's called Deconstructing Your day. So at the end of your day, you get home, you kind of decompress a little bit, you have dinner with the family, whatever you're doing, then take like 10, 15 minutes to yourself in a quiet place and deconstruct your day. And this could be just a mental exercise, or it could be a written one, but just think back to your day, reflect back and go, how did I handle that call, on A Street today? It didn't go so well. How could I have done that a little bit better? How could I have handled that interaction with my boss today? I could have handled that a little bit better. Or, I really did a good job on that, in that conversation with my peer. And deconstruct your day. And then what I like to do is I have a journal, and I just write all this stuff down. I'm a big journaler. So I'll write down, like, be a little more patient with, your son tomorrow, or, it could be personal, it could be professional, whatever it is. And that really helps me, because again, if you just allow yourself to just run on autopilot, typically you're gonna stray, but if you're intentional about these interactions, your communication, how you're trying to improve, it's gonna be so much better. So I love, you made me think of that tip that I give people a lot, is deconstructing their day. So thank you for sharing that.
That's great information. I really think that it's healthy for all of us to think about what we could do different. So I do the exact same thing you do.
Nice.
What did I do today? What can I do different with what I did today? And then how am I going to apply that to tomorrow? So that's a great way to end the show. I love that.
One of the things I tell Rachel is, like, write on a sticky note, I'm going to be better than I was yesterday. And you know what? It's, it works, because, when you remind yourself, some of us have, I look at forums and people hate their jobs, being police officers, people hate their jobs. I'm like, dude, we have one of the best jobs in the world. We get to serve the public. We get to be part of people's, evolution of their community. I mean, we get to do that. And I think that gets lost sometimes. And, we go to the motions like, oh, I got to do this again. I'm like, you know what? Even my wife, she was a server for many years, and she hated people. Like, hey, you're in the service industry. You're
people
here to
can be
serve,
difficult.
And I get it. But you know what? At the end of the day, I've never gone home and say, I hate my job. I've never done that, because at the end of the, and maybe I'm wired different, because I love talking to people. I love meeting people, getting to know them, getting to, and helping them out. Because at the end of the day, that is so rewarding. And I think us as public servants, how do we help folks, it's the best. It's the best deal around. I mean, you can't, you can't buy that. I mean, for us trying to get into this profession, it was hard, for a lot of people. They try years to
Sure.
get into police officers. They try years to get into, and then when they're there, they either thrive or they don't thrive. And they become cynical or, they excel. But at the end of the day, I think we are in a profession where we need to have that emotional intelligence. We need the leadership skills, the soft skills, because at the end of the day, we're essential. Code enforcement is essential service,
Absolutely.
and people forget that. And I love all the information that you're bringing to us today. It's great
Thank you.
information. We can keep another 2 hours, but and I told you, like, we've been doing this for about 55 minutes now, and I'm like, we can keep going. And
I know. It's
time
good
just
stuff.
flies.
It
It's great
does. It
stuff,
does. Yeah. Thank you. Well, thank you guys so much for the opportunity to come on your show and to talk about stuff that I love to talk about, that you love to talk about. And I'm just thankful for you, and I'm thankful for everyone in the code enforcement profession. I live in a beautiful community here in the city of Orange, in Orange County, and they do a great job with, keeping the community safe and looking good and avoiding, neighborhood decay. And that's really important. It's important to me and my family. And so I appreciate everything you guys do and what your listeners do. So thank you.
Likewise, sir. Absolutely likewise. Listening
Thanks
to
for
you.
putting my website up there. Thank you.
No, that's what we do. I mean, you're a great inspiration. I love the leadership qualities that you bring to us, and you know what? Others will benefit from what you're doing. And if you haven't caught some of his videos, go to chiefleadership.com. And I'm telling you, like, when I saw this, I'm like, I have to get this guy on our show. This is one of the things I'm like, you know what? And I reached out to him, and he's like, sure. And you know what? Hey, if I wouldn't have done that, you wouldn't be here today. And we had a lot of people that did respond today. Said, you know what? Here, you have Anna Contreras over here saying thank you. She's with the code manager city of Tracy.
Thanks,
great.
Anna.
She does a lot of good stuff. So, anyway,
Yolanda, we had a lot of great comments from our guests today, and thank you always for joining us, folks. We love to hear your awesome comments in the chat, and what try to bring you relevant information that kind of sticks to your heartstrings. So
Nice.
thank you for being on today, sir. It was an absolute pleasure.
Course. All right. Thank you, guys.
And thank you, and we hope you have a great day. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye.
All right. Stay safe, guys.
All right.
Bye-bye.
See ya.